Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Store Torungen. And the first major debate, except for the last night that we had the youth politicians here. This is one of the major debates that we have here in Arendalsuka. I'm very proud and very privileged to introduce the first dialogue that we have. It's the climate change and the road to Paris. And we are very privileged to have with us the chairman of the IPCC, Dr. Pachauri, and we also have with us our own Minister of Environmental and Climate, Tine Sundtoft, combined with a panel of the major NGOs on this theme. This is one of the important debates that our society has to take, because we hope, of course, that there will be an agreement in Paris next autumn, and we are very proud that all the important debates and important discussions take place here in Arendal during the Arendals Week. So again, welcome everybody, and let me introduce the first to the floor, Dr. Pachauri. Give him a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Your Excellency, Madam Minister of the Environment, Governor Jupadal, mayors, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a distinct pleasure to be here today. This is the second time I've been at the Arendal Week, and may I say that this event is going to get increasingly greater attention from all over the world, because it's discussing issues that really are going to make a difference to the future of humanity and the future of this planet. It's a distinct privilege to have Her Excellency the Minister here as part of this session. I've had the pleasure of seeing her at the northern tip of Ny-Ålesund some months ago, which in itself is a unique experience. And I have no hesitation in repeating what I said earlier. Arendal is clearly one of the most beautiful spots in the whole world. And for you to come up with an agenda that essentially highlights the beauty of human existence and the beauty of nature is very fitting, coming from a place like this. Now, I'm going to be talking to you about the findings of the 3 working group reports of the IPCC, which have come out in recent months. We are now involved in the completion of the synthesis report, which would be completed at the end of October. And we will release it on the 2nd of November, hopefully in the presence of the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Ban Ki-moon. I'll start with my first slide, and that is essentially what I would like to highlight as the important part of the roadmap to Paris and beyond. It was Einstein who said problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. And how true that is. Because often we create problems out of ignorance, out of lack of knowledge on a particular subject. But today we have the benefit of knowledge which has been provided by thousands of scientists from all over the world. And most importantly, this is knowledge which has been endorsed and accepted by all the governments of the world, 195 governments which are members of the IPCC. So let me give you some facts which I think would be relevant in giving you an indication of how large an undertaking an IPCC assessment is. And as you would see over here, if you look at the Working Group 1 report, we have, to our credit, the efforts of a large number of scientists, 259 authors, drawn from 59 countries. And you would also be interested to know that at every stage of the drafting of a report, it goes through a series of expert reviews as well as finally government reviews. And the number of comments that we receive is staggering. And each comment has to be taken into account by the authors. And they have to record what they did with a particular comment. If they accept it, they just write accepted, and of course they modify the draft accordingly. If they don't accept it, they've got to give reasons why they don't accept it. So it's a very transparent, it's a very democratic, and a very open process. And as you can see, in the Working Group 1 report, we had almost 55,000 comments. The sheer volume of this is substantial. And you have somewhat similar figures for the Working Group 2 report, 309 authors drawn from 70 countries, and over 50,000 comments. The Working Group 3 report had 235 authors drawn from 57 countries and almost 40,000 comments. So this is essentially just an indication of the complexity and the size of the effort that goes into the production of each one of these reports. Now, we came up with some very important conclusions, which I hope will provide a guidepost to the discussions and deliberations that take place in moving up to Paris. There's a 95% certainty that human influence has been the dominant cause of observed warming since the mid-20th century. This, may I say, is up from the previous fourth assessment report, which came out in 2007, where we had assigned a probability of 90% and above. So now we have enough evidence and enough certainty to say that there's a 95% plus certainty of this having happened. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. And this clearly brings out the fact that in a very short period of time, human society has really altered the conditions that lead to changes in climate. If you compare it to the time frame over which these changes, which are unprecedented, have taken place. So limiting climate change will require sustained and substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, I think we need to raise the level of ambition of human society to accept the fact that we will have to bring about some major reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if we want to limit climate change in the future. Now, if you look at some of the implications of climate change, ocean warming has dominated the increase in energy stored in the climate system. More than 90% of the energy accumulated between 1971 and 2010 has gone into the oceans. So that, of course, has led to very rapid warming of the oceans, which has major implications for marine life and, of course, the ecosystems that we see under the sea. And the rate of sea level rise since the mid-19th century has been larger than the mean rate during the previous 2 millennia. And if you look at the quantitative increase in sea level rise, it's been 19 centimeters during the period 1901 to 2010. Now, that, of course, is quite considerable because just remember, there are several parts of the world which are low-lying, small island states, very low-lying coastal areas. In our own neighborhood, I come from India. We have Bangladesh, a large part of which is very low-lying, and you can imagine the tens of millions of people who would be threatened with this particular phenomenon. Then over the last 2 decades, what we've also seen, and this is something of enormous interest to a country like Norway, the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets have been losing mass. Glaciers have continued to shrink almost worldwide. And Arctic sea ice and Northern Hemisphere spring snow cover have continued to decrease in extent. Observed warming in permafrost temperatures was up to 3 degrees Celsius in parts of northern Alaska. This was in the period 1980s to mid-2000s, and up to 2 degrees Celsius in parts of the Russian European North. So here, this is an important observation. The Arctic region has been warming much faster than the rest of the globe. In fact, almost twice as rapidly as the rest of this planet. Now, we'd like to understand where these emissions of greenhouse gases are coming from and what it is that is leading to human-induced climate change. Now, if you look at this diagram, electricity and heat production accounts for 25%. Then you have what is known as AFOLU, which stands for agriculture, forestry, and land use. Buildings account for a significant amount, transport, industry, and so on. And on the right-hand side of this diagram, you would see indirect emissions, because if you look at industry, for instance, industry is responsible for using a large range of raw materials, a large range of inputs, and all of these also account for emissions in greenhouse gases. Now, globally, we know that economic and population growth continue to be the most important drivers of increases in CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. These are expected to continue to drive emissions growth without additional efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Warming will continue beyond 2100 under all the 4 scenarios that we have examined in the IPCC. And I might mention what these 4 scenarios are. The highest of these, of course, is the do-nothing scenario, where we allow emissions to continue on a business-as-usual basis. And naturally, that's going to lead to much greater warming and much higher levels of climate change than the other scenarios. The lowest scenario is what we call the RCP 2.6 scenario, where essentially, before the end of the century, we go into a zone of negative emissions. Now, we wanted to test the impacts of this scenario on the extent of climate change, because you need to find out what it is that a set of actions will result in as far as the extent of climate change is concerned by the end of this century. And what you see over here in these 2 diagrams, on the left side is the RCP 2.6 scenario. That's the low emissions scenario, the lowest emissions scenario. And on the right-hand side, which shows you much higher temperatures, as indicated by the shading of these 2 diagrams, which is the result of a do-nothing and business-as-usual kind of scenario. Let me turn to the next slide now. And I would like to highlight the fact that extreme events during and by the end of the 21st century are a cause for concern. It's very likely that the length, frequency, and/or intensity of warm spells or heat waves will increase over most land areas. This is happening, and this is going to continue in the future, and we need to be very sure about what we need to do under these conditions. Under some scenarios, in fact, a 1 in 20-year hottest day is likely to become a 1 in 2-year event in most regions. It's also likely that the frequency of heavy precipitation or the proportion of total rainfall from heavy falls will increase over most areas of the globe. So much so that there is some evidence that those particular areas which actually see a decline in average precipitation will find most of that precipitation taking place in the form of very heavy falls. Now that, as you can imagine, has some risks for life and property. It also has major implications for our ability to store and to be able to use all that water that comes down in a sudden rush in a short period of time. And this may involve the creation of some new infrastructure. So overall, I would like to say that we have to adapt to some of these changes because they're going to take place through the rest of this century and beyond. I would take you to the next slide now. These are some changes in the climate system that I'm sure will be of concern to all Norwegians, as it should be to the rest of the world. The Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink and thin, and that's happening already. The Northern Hemisphere spring snow cover will decrease during the 21st century as global mean surface temperature rises. Global glacier volume will continue to decrease. That's also happening across the globe. And some models actually project that you would have a nearly ice-free Arctic Ocean in September before mid-century with the 8.5 RCP scenario. So in other words, if we don't do anything, and we continue with emissions of greenhouse gases on a business as usual basis, then in 2050, when you go to Ny-Ålesund, as I had the privilege of going with Her Excellency the Minister, in September, you may see no sea ice at all. Now that clearly is a very daunting prospect. None of us wants to see that happening. I'll go to the next slide, and this gives you projections of global mean sea level rise by the end of the century. And again, if we move along on a business as usual, do nothing scenario, then by the end of the century, you could get sea level rise of 0.98 meters. That's virtually a meter. And that, you can imagine, would be a serious threat. And I'm sure Arendal, which is such a responsible town when it comes to managing the emissions of greenhouse gases and showing a very high level of ambition in reducing its carbon footprint, would probably also have to think in terms of adapting to sea level rise at that level. And yesterday we had the privilege and pleasure of being taken by His Excellency the Governor on a boat ride. I think the boats will have to be moored somewhere else then, if you have sea level rise of 1 meter. So these are just some realities that are possible and are projected if we don't do anything about the problem. Let me go to this slide. We must also be aware of possible abrupt and irreversible impacts. You could have sustained mass loss by ice sheets, some of which are irreversible, and this can cause larger sea level rise. And sustained warming, we have estimated, greater than some threshold, greater than about 1 degree Celsius, but less than 4 degrees global mean warming. In other words, we can't really predict where those thresholds lie, but they are there, and they are certainly within this range of 1 degree Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius. These could lead to near complete loss of the Greenland ice sheet over a millennium or more, and this could cause global mean sea level rise of up to 7 meters. Now, these thresholds are something that are very difficult to predict in precise terms, but the range that is given over here provides you with enough of a warning that we need to avoid this at all cost. So this is an issue that I think should be at the base of our ambition to deal with the problem of climate change. In the next slide, I'd like to show you some impacts of climate change on Arctic communities. Well, firstly, some commercial activities will become more profitable, while others will decline. I mean, if you want to look only at commerce, you only want to look at economic benefits in a very narrow sense, yes, there would be some improvements for some parties. And increased economic opportunities are expected with increased navigability in the Arctic Ocean. Surely, if sea ice is going to reduce, then the Arctic becomes much more navigable for much longer periods during the year, and that clearly would have some benefits for some parties. The informal subsistence-based economy will be impacted. And there are a lot of people who are part of that informal subsistence-based economy. I've been to the northern part of Sweden, and of course, having been to Svalbard, I've seen some of that in that area as well. And I've been to Greenland, which also has some part of that kind of living situation. Changing sea ice conditions will result in more difficult access for hunting marine mammals. Impacts, of course, that's something which is probably good news for marine mammals. And if they can read the IPCC fifth assessment report, they would probably be celebrating a bit. Impacts on the health and well-being of Arctic residents are significant and projected to increase, especially for many indigenous peoples. Now, here I'd like to point out an important reality that we should keep at the center of the response that we have to the problem of climate change. Climate resilience pathways combine adaptation and mitigation to reduce climate change and its impacts. Since mitigation reduces the rate and magnitude of warming, it also increases the time available for adaptation to a particular level of climate change, potentially by several decades. Now, this is an important observation because to deal with climate change, we would need a combination of adaptation and mitigation. Why adaptation? Well, simply because there is so much inertia in the system that whatever we do today, even to bring down emissions of greenhouse gases drastically, there is a certain inertia which will continue with climate change impacts for several decades into the future. So we will have to adapt to them. And some of these relate to every sector of the economy. But at the same time, we must remember that if we don't mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases, then we could be entering those thresholds which I referred to that would make it very difficult for us to adapt beyond a certain stage. Also, we must remember that mitigation gives us that leeway of perhaps a few decades more that allows us to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Let me give you just one example. If you look at the impacts on agriculture, clearly what this would require is the development of seed varieties that are more drought resistant, that would be able to give you fairly good yields of agricultural crops under very adverse conditions. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. This will take a lot of research and development, and that would require possibly a decade or 2 or 3, who knows. And therefore, we need that additional time which mitigation will be able to give us and allow us to come up with adaptation measures that are going to be effective. Now, adaptation in the Arctic region will require a number of initiatives, and this would involve societal, economic, and political factors. Arctic indigenous peoples are already implementing creative ways of adapting. They're changing resource bases. I mean, where they find resources are being affected, they are moving to other bases and accessing them, shifting land use and or settlement areas, combining technologies with traditional knowledge. This, of course, is crucial because there is the wealth of indigenous knowledge which could be enhanced through much more scientific and technological efforts that all of us are now capable of. Changing timing and location of hunting, gathering, herding, and fishing areas, improving communications and education, protection of grazing land will be the most important adaptive strategy for reindeer herders under climate change. Now, when it comes to mitigation, we know for a fact that mitigation will require substantial efforts. But really speaking, these are efforts that are not going to in any way ruin the economy of the world. Because if you look at this diagram, it shows in the upper line GDP growth without mitigation, and below that, the blue line is GDP growth with stringent mitigation. That means the objective of 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent being reached in 2100. Now, this essentially would involve costs. And if you look at the costs in 2030, the median value of this cost would be 1.7% of the total consumption of the world. In 2050, it will be higher, it will be 3.4% of the global consumption. So therefore, you can see that this is not a very high price to pay for essentially ensuring that we keep below the 2 °C limit of climate change and warming that the world has set as its ambitious target. Now, if you look at stringent mitigation scenarios, what do they involve? Lower global greenhouse gases in 2050 than in 2010. These would have to be 40 to 70% lower globally than what we had in 2010. So in the next 36 or 35 years, what we have to ensure is that we bring about a reduction of 40 to 70% in emissions of greenhouse gases using 2010 as the baseline. And by the end of the century, we would need to come to emissions levels which are zero in gigatons of CO2 equivalent or below. So in other words, we'll have to enter into a stage where emissions are actually negative. So that's the challenge before us. And this would involve a tripling or nearly a quadrupling of the share of energy supply from renewables by 2050. Now, Norway, of course, has a substantial amount of biomass that could be a major source of mitigation efforts. You have wind, you have renewables. There would be possibilities for improvements in energy efficiency. So there's a whole range of options that are available. And in fact, many scenarios that would reach 450, 500, or 550 parts per million of CO2 equivalent by 2100 would require widespread deployment of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, afforestation, that means large-scale spread of afforestation, forestry efforts, and other carbon dioxide reduction technologies post-2050. So all of this needs to be evaluated across the globe, and we can then come up with strategies that would work. Now, as it happens, the costs of some of these renewable energy technologies are already very attractive. As you can see in this diagram, the left side band gives you the cost of conventional energy supply, and the bars that you see over here is the range of costs of renewables. So I think we are at the cusp of change. We are at a stage where you would find opportunities for using renewable energy on a much larger scale for a whole range of applications than was the case earlier. And as it happens, there are huge co-benefits from the use of some of these mitigation opportunities. These would give you improved energy efficiency and security, cleaner energy sources, much better air quality and human health, reduced energy and water consumption in urban areas. It will give you sustainable agriculture and forestry, protection of ecosystems for carbon storage. And therefore, if you look at the actual benefits, these co-benefits, then the cost of mitigation actually pales into insignificance. Mitigation then becomes much more attractive and therefore a very wise strategy to follow. Climate change and sustainable development, there's a very clear link. A stable climate is one component of sustainable development. You can't leave the world with a climate that is going to affect coming generations adversely, because that clearly, I mean, as an iconic Norwegian, Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland has told us through the work of her commission, sustainable development is that form of development which meets the needs of the present generation without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So if you leave the next generation with a lousy climate, you're really not helping them to meet their own needs. And that's something to keep in mind. Limiting the effects of climate change is necessary to achieve sustainable development and equity, including poverty eradication. And designing an effective climate policy involves mainstreaming climate in the design of sustainable development strategies. Options for equitable burden sharing can reduce the potential for costs of climate change to constrain development. So it's becoming increasingly clear that we need an unprecedented level of international cooperation to be able to get the best out of the opportunities that we have available in economic, organizational, and human terms. And I'll turn to the last slide. It was Margaret Mead who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So I don't think any one of us should feel pessimistic. Any one of us should feel that, oh, well, I'm much too small to be able to make a difference. Because remember, each one of us can do our bit. And certainly we need leadership at an unprecedented level, leadership of very high caliber, by which perhaps a few people can really bring about change that will move us in the right direction. And therefore, we need to start focusing on what really counts. Of course, the world is so focused on higher levels of consumption, GDP growth, but it was Gandhi who rightly said, speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. So what's the point of looking at what we call progress if that's going to impose major costs in human terms, in economic terms, not only for this generation, but for coming generations? I was to show a brief video. It's working? Okay. Can we just show a little bit of it, and I'll cut it off in between because I'm conscious of the time.
Solar phaga maka light chitai ke do zangai ngan la mai bu mon mok ke aja ning ke jong na.
Not too long back, Thangam counted one amongst the 289 million Indians living in complete darkness. Even today, 1.3 billion people around the world use kerosene lamps and inhale its toxic fumes every evening. In India, some of these lives are changing. The sun does set, but it still lights up their nights. It was in 2007 that Terry launched Lighting a Billion Lives with a clear vision to put in place a strong entrepreneurial model that delivers affordable solar lighting to unelectrified or poorly electrified villages. The program today is enabling lives of the poorest of poor across the world. In India, the program has reached out to 22 states. Globally, the program has reached out to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, Ghana, Niger, and Sierra Leone. Over the last few years, the program has connected with hundreds and thousands of rural communities living without the basic amenities of life. We built trust, raised awareness, and continued to innovate to meet the energy needs of diverse communities. The program started with the model of a centralized solar charging station that can charge up to 50 portable LED solar lights. A local entrepreneur is trained to manage the station. Every morning, the villagers leave behind discharged lanterns and collect fully charged lanterns in the evening for a rental of 2 to 5 rupees per day. This is just as much or often less than what an average rural household spends on kerosene. The seed capital for setting up a solar charging station is raised by Terry with the support of donor agencies, local entrepreneurs, and end users. Once functional, the local entrepreneur sustains this enterprise through the daily rentals collected from the users.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to give you an indication of how in rural areas you can bring about a transition from traditional methods of energy use, which are polluting, which place a huge burden on human beings, and move towards efficient, renewable energy-based systems that are clean, durable, and sustainable. So this is just an example of how thinking out of the box can give us opportunities by which we can improve the lives of people and also mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pachauri.
Thank you.
I'm Oddvar Stenström, and I'm going to moderate a discussion or maybe a dialogue about the road to Paris. Because as you know, there is a very important global climate conference in that city next year. But before the discussion, we'll have one more speaker. And that speaker is the one with the most important job in the government. Please welcome Tine Sundtoft.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sørlandet. My hometown is Lillesand. Thinking globally, Lillesand is only a stone's throw from here. I've been involved in local and regional politics in the Agder region for more than 25 years, so I feel at home speaking to you here in Arendal today. Dr. Pashori has just presented the most recent science from IPCC. The conclusion is clear. Climate change is real. It is caused by us. It's happening now. In May this year, Dr. Pashori, as he told you, and I took part in the New Ålesund Symposium in Svalbard. The impacts of climate change are more evident in the Arctic than any other place. The region is warming 2 times faster than the global mean. We saw the effect with our own eyes. Fjords that used to be covered by ice till early summer are now almost completely opened year-round. This creates very poor conditions for ice seals and polar bears. But the melting of the Arctic is first and foremost a global concern. The white Arctic sea ice is a good sun reflector. The dark sea surface is less reflective. When the ice disappears and the open waters absorb the sun's heat, global warming is amplified. As a result of this, the melting of the Greenland ice cap is also increasing. This leads to sea level rise. Which brings us back to Arendal. Arendal is a city by the sea. People like to live and build their houses by the sea. This city even had canals once. This is an ongoing debate on whether these canals should be reopened. I am fascinated by such an idea, but at the same time, climate change poses a threat to Arendal and all other cities by the sea. Sea level rise has the worst consequences for the poor and vulnerable. Climate adaptation and risk management will become more and more important. The good news is that we can slow down climate change by limiting global emissions. The sooner we act, the lower the risk and cost. And this has been very well summed up in the latest reports from the IPCC. This brings me to my second point, the need for international action. We must approach zero net emissions by 2050. This is very ambitious. All countries will have to take part to the best of our abilities. We should deliver an ambitious climate agreement in Paris next year. But we also need to act now before the agreement takes effect in 2020. Almost 100 countries have agreed to implement emission reduction targets by 2020. Making sure that these pledges will be implemented is an important signal. It builds trust, and it shows that the targets for 2020 are only a first step. But more countries should follow with setting targets. We should act now in the following areas. We need increased efforts on renewable energy and energy efficiency. There is great potential in carbon pricing, and we need to phase down subsidies of fossil fuels. Another priority is short-lived climate pollutants like methane, HFC, and black carbon. Reduction of these pollutants can quickly improve air quality and slow the rate of near-term climate change. This is also an opportunity that should not be missed. Reduced deforestation is one of the cheapest and most efficient ways to close the emission gap. In April, I visited Indonesia and saw proof that our REDD+ engagement actually works. But most importantly, we must deliver an ambitious and forward-looking climate agreement in Paris. It should be guided by the 2-degree target. It should be a lasting agreement. The agreement could have a long-time goal to make us able to assess how we are doing. The agreement must be both ambitious and fair. To be ambitious, every country should be on board. To be fair, we must take into account that countries are different. We can all contribute, but in different ways. It will depend on each country's capabilities. A good agreement in Paris would also give a predictable signal to business and investors. There will be no green shift without the private sector. Private finance on a large scale is necessary to make the transformation to a low-carbon society. And the question is, will we be able to close a good agreement in Paris? We will probably not get the perfect agreement, but we must be optimistic and plan for success. The former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Ivo de Boer, said last month that the United Nations climate negotiations have made greater progress towards agreeing a 2015 deal to bind all nations to cut greenhouse gas emissions than the lead-up to the previous attempt in 2009 in Copenhagen. I will use all opportunities to push the agenda forward. I was one of the few ministers who defended our action up to 2020 in Bonn in June. I hosted the informal meeting in New Orleans in May. I also co-hosted an informal ministerial meeting for progressive countries in Brussels in April, together with the EU Commissioner of Climate Action, Connie Hedegaard. And together with Connie Hedegaard, I will invite to a follow-up meeting in New York on 20th of September. Norway will remain a front-runner in international efforts to combat deforestation. Norway is donating considerable amounts of money to climate finance in developing countries and will continue to do so. We have pledged to maintain funding to our forest initiative at least the same level until 2020. I co-hosted the first meeting to capitalize the Green Climate Fund in Oslo in June. Norway plans to announce a contribution for the Green Climate Fund at the Climate Summit in New York next month. Norway will also do its part at home. We have started our preparations for our contribution to the 2015 agreement, and our long-term goal is that Norway should be a low-emission society in 2050. According to a report from Norwegian Environment Agency, there remains 8 million tons of CO2 reduction to reach the 2020 goal. We have a demanding job ahead of us. One of our main priorities is to increase investment in climate-friendly technology. We are also working to establish a green tax commission. The purpose is to make it more expensive to pollute and more profitable to act green. However, as Minister of Climate and Environment, I will need support and help from all sectors of society. And we need good solutions, and engaging with the public and the NGO sector like here today is therefore very valuable to me. To effectively curb climate change and reach our 2-degree target, we will need a clear focus and a strong will. I am confident that a vision of a climate-safe world with green growth opportunities will inspire both governments and business to do their part. I think there still is a window of opportunity now leading up to Paris. And all of us, let us use it well. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will have a discussion, and we will be talking about the most important and the main issues leading up to the important Paris talks next year. And Dr. Pachauri and Minister Sundtoft will be joined by leaders of 3 Norwegian environmental groups: Lars Haltbrekken, Naturvernforbundet, Marius Holm Zero, og Arild Hermstad, Framtiden i våre hender. Give them a hand. Financial Times had a very thoughtful comment not long ago, and I quote, "It will be quite a moment if the Paris talks succeed, and a very familiar moment if they do not." Dr. Pachauri, do you feel confident that the talks in Paris will be a success?
Well, I'm very optimistic, and I think the reason for that is the extent of awareness that exists today all over the world on the reality of climate change, on the science underlying climate change. And I would say that, as I mentioned right at the outset, with the level of awareness that we have, there is clearly a very strong determination that I find all around the world to do something and to come up with an agreement in Paris. So yes, I am very optimistic, and I hope the world will be well served by all the governments of the world in arriving at an agreement that helps this generation and generations yet to come to deal with this massive challenge.
Mr. Sundtoft, do you share this optimism?
Yeah, I think we cannot plan for anything else than success in Paris. And after the meetings this summer, I met the US and China discussing the climate changes in Berlin, and the new signals of the 2 biggest countries in the world are better. So I'm not very positive, but I'm more optimistic.
You're smiling. Lars Haltbrekken.
Well, it's too late to be a pessimist because the situation is so dramatic, and there is no alternative than to succeed in Paris. But there's one thing a rich country like Norway should bear in mind up front before Paris, and that is action speaks louder than words. By doing the reductions needed at home, we show the world that it is possible, and that is what we should do over the coming months here in Norway.
What about you, Marius Holm?
Well, I'm optimistic on behalf of the climate and mankind, but I'm not very optimistic about Paris. I fear that we will get an agreement which is not good enough to really drive change. So what makes me optimistic still is the combined results from the Paris negotiation track and the efforts done by countries, companies, and individuals globally. The shift we are witnessing in the energy sector, where solar and wind energy is becoming competitive and cheaper than fossils, it's driven by politics. It's driven by countries like Germany, like Spain, like California. And that change makes me optimistic, because the market will at some stage take over for politicians as a driving force.
But what you are saying you are optimistic, but you don't believe it will be a success, because it's not good
yes,
enough.
I am optimistic about climate. I think we will be able to turn this ship around. But I don't think Paris is the one happening that makes that happen, if you know. So I think we need to do both. Paris, it will be the most important milestone in a long time, absolutely. But in order to have success, we cannot wait for consensus, because consensus has never changed the world. We need to act, like Lars said, not only by reducing our own emissions, but also by driving this change in technology and the change in market globally. For instance, with our wealth, a very, very clear task for Norway would be to finance the development of renewable energy in the south.
What about you, Arendalsuka?
I think the worst thing we can have is a repetition of what happened in Copenhagen in 2009, a complete failure, where everyone goes back home and think, oh, this is not good. In order to avoid that, I don't know what have been done so far, but I think it's better to get back from Paris with a low-C deal, which is not good enough, than no deal. Because I think politics can do its part, but it cannot do the whole thing. And there is a problem with the scientific community, at the one hand, telling us that 2 degrees is necessary, and we have to do this and that, and that's it's, so to speak, physics. It's not, you can't discuss with the climate researcher, really. I mean, that's happening. And on the other hand, there is this place where we meet and negotiate, where, well, 2 degrees can be 3 degrees, or 450 ppm can be 550 ppm. And that's an arena which is, they're not really fit for each other in a way. So I think we should not, before Paris, we should not repeat what we did before Copenhagen and push up the expectations that this will solve everything, because it's only a part of a very long effort to...
But there have been and will be a lot of meetings before Paris.
Definitely.
But how close are we right now to an agreement as you see it?
Well, I think in the time that's available to us, there are 3 things that we need to do. Firstly, I think the findings of the IPCC reports, and we're going to be bringing out the synthesis report by the end of October, really need to be spread on a large scale. And to be quite honest, the IPCC has very limited capability to be able to do that, although we realize now that it's absolutely essential not only to produce good reports, but to see that the main findings are spread on a large scale. And this is where I would expect that the government of Norway would help the IPCC to do that. The second thing I'd like to say is that, yes, it's important to see that the negotiating process leads to success, but I find it very heartening that businesses, small towns, cities, provinces all over the world are also taking this job very seriously. I think all of them should be mobilized for bringing about a result in Paris. And finally, I think the agenda for the meeting in Paris should focus adequately on the scientific findings of the IPCC. It's a 2-week-long meeting. And if you look at what has happened in the past, much more in the case of Warsaw, where we had a lot of science, but in general, typically, you just don't focus on the scientific assessment of the IPCC. You just get bogged down by short-term and narrow considerations, and the 2 weeks go by very fast. So I think the meeting this time has to be planned extremely well, and it has to ensure that the driving force is the scientific reality of climate change. I think if we were to do that, hopefully we will get a good and useful agreement in Paris. And finally, I agree with the point that was made. I think each country in the world has to set an example. Gandhi very rightly said, be the change you want to see in the world. So if we want the world to do something, let's start doing it ourselves.
Sundtoft, how close are we? Are we close to an agreement now, or is it just far away?
We are closer now than we were in 2009 in Copenhagen, and I think also because of the IPCC reports, we know more now than we did in 2009. And in 1 month, we get the report from the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón's report on new climate economy, a very important report 1 week before the climate summit in New York, hosted by Ban Ki-moon. So I totally agree with Zero. The green shift is coming now. There are more people that believe in the market, that we can see by our own eyes that the private sector is working so hard to get the new technology. We have answers to a lot of the challenges. So the private sector, the market, and of course, and political agreement. It is all of these combinations who are very important to get the
You agree we are close to an agreement?
We might be closer to an agreement than we were in 2009, but we do also see ministers of environment throughout the world downplaying the expectations for the outcome of Paris. And I think...
Why do they do that?
Because they might not think that we get the agreement that the world actually needs. But my point of view is that we should have great expectations to our leaders. They are set there. We have elected them to solve this problem, and we need great expectations, and we have to expect a lot more than is being done now. As I said, we might be closer, but still too much time is spent in these negotiations discussing commas. We need discussions on how to reduce and who should take the biggest part in sharing the costs of reducing the emissions to the level that the world can bear.
And that's a painful discussion, Marius.
Well, if you look at what the practical things that needs to change to reach the 2-degree target, you know, basically we need to phase out fossil fuels from the energy sector, from electricity sector, and from the transport sector. And that obviously has massive impacts on the economics of countries like Norway and other oil and coal exporting countries. And if you look at what Norway does, Sundtoft, representing the government, is optimistic about a climate deal in Copenhagen, while her government invests in more fossil fuel production at a higher level than ever. And if the government really believed that the world will change in 2015, they would have changed their investment policy from fossils to renewables. And since that's not happening, they are not really that confident. But the reason why I am optimistic still is that, you know, when the market shifts, when leaders around the world do their job at home, like Lars said, you know, because if countries like Norway reduce our emissions, it's not only about a symbolic act, it's not only about showing will, it's also about the fact that in order to reduce Norwegian emissions, we would need to innovate new technologies, new industry processes, new transport solutions that can be transferred to other countries afterwards.
Sundtoft, you can answer that criticism.
I think we now see that investors have discovered climate risk. So we see a change now, which is very important. And we talk about the green shift is coming. And when the investors...
But you're talking about the private sector, not what you are doing. Or
Yeah,
what?
but if we want to get a good solution, we want to have the private sector on board in this question. And we want... we are a country producing oil and gas, but we also is a country working international to put a price on carbon. And we know that if we get a price on carbon, our oil investments will not be as good as they have been.
I think we can talk about private sector, but I think it's very important to note that much of the private sector is publicly owned. We have the pension fund. We have all the pension funds that we as consumers are having for our pension. And this is money that we can put in work for a better future, for a sustainable future. And then we need the politicians also to make political brave decisions. And they don't do that. They kind of, well, we need the private sector, but they don't use their ownership actively to actually push that forward. And also as the government is also a big consumer that can go forward and ask for green consumption. I think it's not being done, and one of the problems with the green shift is that, well, we can sit here and talk, well, it's coming, but if the politicians are making it coming slower, that is very bad news. And I think if we look at the next, are we closer to a deal now than we were in 2009? I think first we have to admit that we lost 6 years, that actually we had a big momentum in 2009. And so we have lost a lot of time in order to cut the emissions so fast that we should do. So any scientific-based government should actually push forward with much stronger commitment than what we're doing at the moment. And that includes Norway as well, I think.
But the private sector is not driving the green shift, as Sundtoft said. The private sector is only responding to political instruments. That's a very important notion because, you know, the only reason why investors invest in solar production is that political incentives have made it profitable. And the most important sort of observation from that development is how powerful nations can be when they, rather than waiting for global consensus, act right now. So you only need a couple of countries, a couple of small to medium-sized economies to change a sector globally by introducing new technology, growing the market for that technology so that costs are reduced and things become competitive. We don't need to wait for consensus. We can do it right now.
I also think that we see a greater shift amongst private investors the last years. But we need to see the same shift amongst our politicians. And as Arild mentioned, our pension fund here in Norway, during the climate change negotiations in Warsaw last year, it was presented a list of the 90 multinational companies who were responsible for 2/3 of the emissions leading to climate change. And the fact is, Norway has, through its pension fund, invested in half of these 90 most responsible companies. We should stop doing that. We should not invest our money, our future money, in supporting companies that heat this world in a dramatic way. And we also need to address the big elephant in the room here in Norway, which is our oil and gas production. Norway is actually the 4th largest producers of fossil fuels per capita in the world.
Well, let's go to that. Dr. Pachauri, what do you think that Norway should do with its oil and gas production?
Well, to be honest, I wouldn't want to comment on what Norway can do. We have very active NGO leaders over here. You have very responsible politicians, and the people of Norway are very enlightened individuals, and I think it's best for them to decide what they should do. But what I will say is, yes, we're at a stage where a large number of technologies are available that could be utilized. There are a whole range of other lifestyle opportunities by which we can reduce emissions, start reducing them rapidly right now. But what we need is a framework of policies by which individuals, the private sector, and governments see the benefits of moving in that direction. Whether it's a price on carbon, or regulatory measures or benchmarks and standards that are implemented, I think there's a lot that can be done. I'd like to see a lot of that happening in the very near future. In Norway, in India, in China, in the US, everywhere. Because the opportunities are there, and I think we have to start seizing them rather quickly.
I see you have to be polite, but let me ask you another one.
Well, I'm in Norway and I need to catch my flight. I don't want to get into trouble.
Let me ask you in another way then. Would you appreciate if you reduced our oil and gas production? Would that be a good signal to the rest of the world?
I would like to see the world changing its emissions of greenhouse gases in the right direction. If Norway is part of that, so be it.
Okay. Sintoft, will you do that?
We all know that the future is not a fossil future. And the Norwegian oil production peaked back in 2004. And as I said, we are a country, an oil and gas country, who really wants to get a global price on carbon. And we know that in the future, our oil investments will not be very beneficial. So, because we know that the future it's not fossil, but it's a very important debate in Norway to stop the oil production during the night. It's not actionable, but we want to use the money from the oil and gas to get into the green shift, to put more of the other industries to bringing the new technology. I think that is more important than to stop the oil production during the night.
Okay.
It's okay, we cannot stop the oil production during the night, and I don't think that anyone has suggested to do so in Norway either. But what we should stop is handing out new licenses to the oil companies for new drillings that will create enormous amount of emissions in the years to come, when we are supposed to reach a future where there are no CO2 emissions at all. And if we look at the latest IPCC report, we see that the world has discovered up to 7 times more coal, oil and gas than we actually can burn. And when Norway is such a huge producer of oil and gas, we should start reducing, at least stop handing out new licenses to the oil companies. And we do not have the time to wait for, we do not have the time to wait for a global CO2 price to tackle that problem for us.
You agree with him?
Lars Haltbrekken also know that this government didn't start oil production in Lofoten, Vesterålen and Senja, so we have started.
That's good. Continue with that.
A very, very famous American actress, she was touring Svalbard last week. When she came back, she said the following: politicians can do something with the climate change, but they lack the political will to do what's necessary. Is that the main problem we are not talking about?
Well, I'd like to get the name and address of this actress.
Jodie Foster.
Okay, Jodie Foster, okay. I should get in touch with her. I'll do that.
But do you agree? You are looking at it from the outside. Other politicians, the main problem, they don't have the guts to do what's necessary.
Well, I believe that, in democracies in particular, politicians will do what the people demand of them. And I still believe that it's the awareness of the public that's going to be the major driver of change. Because after all, we can't expect politicians to do something different from what the people want. So I would say that there's really nothing more effective than creating awareness among the public, and that being the main driver of ambition by which change takes place.
But is it true, Sundtoft, you're afraid of what the people will say?
I think you see...
Because you know what you have to do, and you can do it if you want to.
Yeah, but
it will cost me a lot.
Norway is still a small country, but we are a very active country in the global discussions. And what we now see as the political will in United States and China is very important. And as Dr. Pachauri said, it's also about the people's engagement in different countries who also press the political leaders to get the agreement. And that's why Ban Ki-moon has invited all the political leaders to New York next month to really get the political will from the world leaders, not just ministries of environment, but the prime ministers all over the world to get in place the agreement.
I think, Dr. Pachauri, isn't it the problem that you don't have the politicians that you used to have that could say that all I can offer you is blood, sweat and tears? Nowadays, the politicians tell us that, well, we can have the oil industry, we can have growth in consumption, we can have the same level of standards of living, and we don't have to give away on anything and still solve the climate problem. Does that make you a bit depressed sometimes that you see this is going on, or do you think that is it possible to combine all this?
Well, I have an inbuilt antidepressant. I never get depressed. And I'm an eternal optimist. I think things will change. I'm absolutely sure. Let's also remember that once change begins, it can snowball. I mean, it's not going to be at a steady and even rate. I think once the world realizes that action is required, we have the power, we have the ability, we have the potential to really accelerate the rate of change. That's my hope. And I wish that as long as I'm alive, I see that happening.
I think that people accept more than a politician might seem to think if they see that the politics are working. One of the big problems after the failure in Copenhagen in 2009 was that every single, or at least almost every single state leader said that we are here to combat the biggest threat to our society. And they didn't do that. And the people might then get the impression, well, then it might not be the biggest threat to our society, to our future. So I think people need to see action, and they will accept action that works in order to solve this problem.
Well, if you look at the sacrifices people around the world will need to do to combat climate change, one of the major sacrifices is less air pollution. It's less dependence on petroleum states in the Middle East. It's new jobs, cleaner jobs, better health. All those are the sacrifices connected to combating climate change. So I'm quite convinced that people in general are ready to do what it takes. It's only about changing things slightly. And I would like to...
So Minister Sundtoft doesn't have to be worrying about the next election?
No, absolutely not. And that's very important. Very often I hear politicians saying that the voters are not ready for climate politics that works. But I don't think it's true at all. Because I have never seen any voter being sort of negative to renewable energy as such, negative to electric vehicles, negative to modernizing Norwegian industry, negative to energy efficiency. Show me that voter. They're not there. So voters are not the limit. Voters are not the barrier towards change. It's only in the minds of decision makers who needs to show leadership and make things happen.
Well, this is a very relevant point, and I tried to mention the co-benefits of mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases. We unfortunately don't focus on that adequately, that we'll have cleaner air, we'll have higher levels of energy security, we'll have better health. So, it's a win-win opportunity. And I think if we focus on that, then you're right. I think the average citizen on the street, the average voter, would see the benefits of taking action in the right direction. And I believe that we really need to emphasize some of these co-benefits. Now, they're not going to come cheap. They will not happen without our making the effort. But we need to motivate people to make that effort. And if we do, then clearly you will see change happening very quickly.
But let me ask you a naive question then. We know what we have to do. Why don't we just do it? Is it because we don't take it seriously enough? Still, Sundtoft, or no, Dr. Pachar?
Well, human minds have a lot of inbuilt inertia. We really don't change easily. We're so set in our methods. We're so used to driving our automobiles that we seldom think about taking public transport. If we have to go half a kilometer, we don't think of using a bicycle or walking down. We jump into a car and go along. I think we need to bring about changes in perception. And what we are seeing basically is a situation where people say, yes, this has to be done, but they won't do it. That's because of the inertia we have in our minds. And I think leadership, not only at the political level, I would say even religious leadership, I would say social reformers, all of us have to start working in a direction that changes people's mindsets.
Do you have to fight your colleagues in the government? I said you had the most important job there. Do I listen to you?
Yeah, but we need the good political discussions. We have to change the way we live our lives in Norway too. We have to use less energy. We have to walk more, use more bicycle, drive less cars, live in smaller houses, get new jobs. But I think that will be a good life to live as well. So we have to talk about the changes in Norway, and we have to get a global agreement with 190 countries. So it's...
You said most people will agree to do it. Let's take it to a test. Raise your hand. How many here are willing to really pay a price for this?
Everyone.
Special group.
Wonderful.
Thank you. It has been said that Norway will play a leading role in negotiations leading up to the Paris conference. How can we play such a role when we are polluting that much? Sundtoft.
Norway has had a political role in the negotiations. We still have. We are working very closely with the EU, who are taking an active role. And because we are not a member of the EU, we can talk to every country, and we really do that. We are arranging meetings, we are at meetings, and we really want to take the positive and concrete role. Even China told me this summer that Norway's role in the climate agreement is very important. You are positive and you come with good solutions.
Can we give them the
bilateral? We have our problems, but not in the climate agreement.
But can we be trusted? You agree?
Yes. And in 2007, prior to the Copenhagen meeting, Norway did something very important. The former government went to Bali on one of these climate change negotiations, saying that we will put 3 billion Norwegian kroners on the table to protect the world's rainforests as something to do to save the climate. 3 billion Norwegian kroners is an awful lot of money, and this is still being done every year. Next year, Tine Sundtoft, can go to world leaders and say, we acknowledge that we cannot take up all the oil and gas outside our coast. We will leave some of it in the ground.
Time is running out, so we have to try to make some conclusions here. What must an agreement in Paris look like for you to call it a success?
Well, I think it should be fair. It should be the report that was launched this morning by Norwegian Church Aid shows how much all the countries should put on the table for their climate emission cuts at home and what they should do internationally. And I think it should be, most countries should be on board, but it should be, as stated in the Kyoto Protocol, it should be differentiated responsibilities, that the rich countries really has to take a bigger part of the cost, but also that the poorest countries should have development assistance and try to develop without using fossil fuels. In my point of view, there should be much focus on what the fossil fuel industry should look like in the future. That would be the best outcome of this agreement, but unfortunately that is not so much on the agenda.
I agree with Arild, and we need an agreement that has the 2-degree target as a clear target, and it needs new incentives and measures to send capital into the poor nations in developing energy. But I would like to just, one very interesting point that you made, Sundtoft, about spending the money we profit from oil and gas in combating climate change. I would like to sort of challenge the government on that, because the Norwegian government has a net cash flow of hundreds of billion kroner every year from the oil and gas industry. How many % of that cash flow would it be fair to spend on combating the climate change we are causing with our oil and gas industry? The forest billions are like 1% of that. How much would we put into financing renewable energy in the south? We need something similar to the forest billions.
Important question that needs to be answered. I fully agree. And what we need to see in Paris is an agreement that actually leads to action, leads to reduced emissions. And if Paris fails, we need to see environmental ministers, state leaders throughout the world saying that we take action anyway.
Okay, Sundtoft.
We need in Paris an agreement with a long-term perspective, and we need the agreement to have a global price on emissions. And for Norway, we want an international agreement that includes flexible mechanisms so we can do more globally. And we need a deal in Paris with mitigation targets. So there are lots of work to do.
Dr. Pachauri, for you to call it a success, what should it look like?
Well, I would like to see action, as was indicated earlier, and that should be quantifiable action. You see, in 2010, the total global emissions of greenhouse gases were 49 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This had increased over the last 10 years from 39 gigatons to 49 gigatons. I think what we need to do is to see a reversal of this growth, and I think it has to be quantified, it has to be measured, and I would like to see not just vague targets for 2050 or 2100, but something that sets us on the right path as quickly as possible. And I hope that would happen, and I hope people are serious in bringing that about. We shouldn't walk away from Paris with illusions that something has been achieved unless there are tangible results that can be measured.
But let's say the Paris conference is over, and you have to return home without an agreement. Then what, Sundtoft?
We have to plan for success in Paris, so I won't think of that thought now.
Well, that's the last word here and now. Thank you for participating. Og da gjenstår det bare for meg å si at fordi det et nytt arrangement her allerede om en halvtime, klokka 1, så må vi prøve å tømme denne salen raskest mulig. Takk. Thank you.